Okay, thank you everyone for being here. Thanks to the Center for Governance and Markets and especially to Jen for making this series possible. And thank you, Brian, for helping get this all set up and for navigating everything. And a big thank you and welcome to today's guest in the Uses and Abuses of Prediction series, which I hope everyone has been enjoying so far. Today we have with us Dr. Saida Heshmati, who comes to us from Claremont Graduate University, which she is sporting as a brand in her background today. Love the imagery. So she is assistant professor of psychology. Her research lies in the understanding of how optimal development unfolds over time in diverse samples through a dynamic systems perspectives. Using her expertise in human development and state-of-the-art analytical methods, she examines large data sets related to individual and group characteristics that influence psychological well-being as part of positive development. Through her work, she aims to bring together a suite of measurement tools and research designs in the service of developing idiographic, culturally informed, and context-sensitive approaches to understanding optimal development in youth, in particular those who are marginalized. Dr. Heshmati has a multicultural background which has informed her scientific research. She is an Iranian-American scholar and an immigrant who has lived in 5 different countries and traveled to more than 20 countries and still counting. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Heshmati, and I will turn it over to you. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Gail, for the wonderful introduction. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me for this talk. As Gail mentioned, I am an assistant professor at Claremont Graduate University, and I'm in the field of positive developmental psychology. I know it's a mouthful, but it's basically an integration of positive psychology, developmental psychology, and the background that I bring in from quantitative psychology to kind of combine it into a research program that I kind of conduct at CGU. I directed the Wellbeing and Developmental Methods Research Lab, and I am happy to be here with you to talk about predicting well-being in real world and real time. I do want to mention that a lot of my work is contextualized in developmental frameworks as well as cultural contexts. However, I am kind of taking those contexts out for today and purely focusing on kind of the concept of predicting well-being in the real world and real time. So if you're interested in more of the intricacies of how to implement what I talk about today in a more general sense in the developmental field and with a cultural lens, please kind of contact me if you're interested, or you can access my work through my lab website, which I can provide you later. All right. Can I start sharing my slides? Okay, I will do that in a second. Okay. All right, can everyone see my slide?
Looks good.
All right, fantastic. Okay. All right, as I just mentioned, we're gonna do some predictions of well-being, so some fortune telling, as you would see. Interestingly, if you looked for images on prediction, there's a lot of fortune tellers that come up on Google search. So that was a fun fact that I found out. I'm gonna do a little bit of fortune telling myself, and I'm just trying to navigate the Zoom in a second. All right. I'm going to predict what you will be engaged in, at least for the next half an hour to 45 minutes. You will be hearing a little bit about the overview of the science of well-being. You will be hearing about well-being in a real time and real world, and how to measure it, how to capture it. You will be hearing and be exposed to ecological momentary interventions, which are interventions in people's natural environments. I will conclude with the possibilities and challenges of these approaches in predicting well-being in the real world. And after that, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. All right. So first and foremost, what is well-being? That's the question, right? That we're all kind of striving to answer. As a start, I think it's kind of interesting to know that we think of well-being as not only those kind of joyful, pleasurable moments that you kind of experience in a fleeting way, but it also includes healthy functioning, meaning that you want to kind of experience a sense of engagement and competence in life. You want to feel resilient in the face of setbacks. You want to have good relationships and connections with other people and feel supported. You want to feel, belonging to a community. You want to have a sense of meaning and purpose in life, and all of those components, which kind of entail not only the increases of positive emotions and decreases of negative emotions, which is kind of the hedonic aspects of well-being, the momentary pleasures, but also kind of the deep, meaningful aspects of life, which kind of entail the living a good life. And so we want to think of both of those in tandem because they're interrelated, and to kind of form an understanding of someone's well-being. In the year 2000, two brilliant scientists, Mike Csikszentmihalyi and Martin Seligman, Mike is on the left, Martin is on the right, came together to kind of introduce a new field called positive psychology, which kind of helped formalize the kind of scientific investigation of constructs such as well-being. So their kind of pitch was that we've been looking at alleviating suffering for so long in clinical psychology, in so many different fields of psychology, where we're at a point where we also need to know if someone is at survival mode, how can we help them to thrive? So, what are the tools that makes a life worth living? And that's kind of what positive psychology is focused on. And again, it brought about a kind of formalized way of investigating these types of constructs. So just to kind of give you a glimpse of the field overall, I want to show you what the history of well-being research looks like and how ideas have been passed down over time before we get into the nitty-gritty of measuring it and predicting it and all of that. So we did a bibliometric kind of methodology approach, looking at all the scientific articles published in the psychological field, examining these any kind of construct that's kind of related to well-being. So here you see a science map that kind of maps all of the 100 core publications that have been out there since the year 1980s until today, and basically showing you the evolution of the field of well-being and how ideas have been passed down over time. You see at the top are the oldest documents, and then as you go down, the documents are more newer and more recent. At a first glance, when you look at this map, the visualization shows kind of a wider looking map, which kind of, instead of being narrow, which implies that the study of well-being is is really not dominated by only a handful of the same scholars. It's kind of dispersed among different types of scholars out there and different kind of schools of thought. The other takeaway from this map is that there are kind of three clusters that represent three different schools of thought within the science of well-being that really dominate this map. So based on the top 100 documents, we see that there's the red cluster at the top, which is kind of signifying the research that talks about subjective well-being, or the hedonic aspects of well-being, as we call it in psychology. And then there's the yellow cluster, which is focused on the eudaimonic aspects of well-being, and those kind of cluster together. And then the green cluster, which is the mixed positive psychology cluster, that only came about, after the year 2000s or so, when the positive psychology field came about. So you can see that there's a proliferation of scientific research on well-being constructs by different scientists that kind of came about right after the 2000s. Interestingly, this green cluster seems very interrelated, but at the same time, also related to the other clusters, the red ones and the yellow ones, kind of indicating that they are really integrating the science across the different kind of ways of thinking about well-being in order to get a fuller understanding of construct. Right, so now that we know the flow of knowledge across time around the well-being, you might want, like, what is the structure of the science of being? Basically, how does well-being link to other related psychological constructs, and how is it studied? What is the anatomy of the science of well-being? Here you see another science map that was using coword analysis, so keywords that were used in scientific research that were done around well-being were all kind of linked together to understand, what kind of keywords were used alongside well-being in the research. There's a QR code on the top left side of the slide you can use to access an interactive map of the same map you're seeing here, but you can zoom in and zoom out and really kind of get a sense of how all of these components are interrelated and come together. But in a first glance, when we can look at this map, we see around 7-ish clusters that kind of out. First and foremost, kind of the more dominant that pout is the red one, is kind of health focused. We're finding that along with well-being, the keywords around health is mostly used, is very popular. Hence, the health and well-being that we keep on using in our phrases and in our scientific workflows. Next cluster is the happiness cluster, which means, we usually pair up happiness and well-being together to understand how people's experiences are for a good life. And then we have these kind of newer clusters that kind of emerge in the field, and we know based on the recency of the public dates. And these are the cluster, which you see is very much focused on self-esteem and identity, acculturation, discrimination comes out. So kind of well-being science is being integrated into that field of study recently. And this kind of, again, makes sense because of the recent events that are happening around the globe, discriminations happening, and a lot of kind of emphasis and focus on this domain of study. as well as another cluster that is more emerging is the study of loneliness, college students, social media, and all of that, which is again related to the COVID event that happened, with a lot of kind of young people being deprived of the social connections that they were able to do when they were in college, in the presence of other people. And then all of a sudden, you know, they were kind of in isolation. And so that research is also emerging. And something Gail and I were talking about before, how the college are feeling lonely these days, and you know, there needs to be some intervene happening in order to get people connected again. So it's happening. The research is there. We'll see when it actually, you know, translates into practice. All right. So based on all of this, do we know so far? We know that the science of well-being is multiplex. It's transdisciplinary. We know that it's culturally informed, it's contextually responsive and time sensitive, as you can see with the historical times changing. The study of well-being is also changing. And the field is very new compared to a lot of other fields out there, but it's ever evolving. It's really kind of fast growing, and we are seeing a lot of kind of new understandings of well-being coming out on a daily basis. So it's doing great so far. All right, now we know that it's so complicated and complex to really understand well-being and study it, and it transcends you know, the fields, and it's paired up so many different, you know, other aspects. Like we approach measuring it, quantifying it, and how even assess it in people's real experiences as they live their daily lives and in real time. So these are all challenges that face with a construct that is so abstract, multiplex, very person specific. The majority of the studies that have been done are so far, they use questionnaires that are completed by participants at a single time point. So they're kind of normally very generally worded. So they want to kind of get a glimpse of people's general levels of well-being or happiness. So you see some of the popular ones here on the slide. The top one is the Cantrell ladder. This is from the 1960s. It's been around, it's still around, but it only entails one item. And the item is basically to rate kind of your life, your experiences in life, based on these steps of the ladder of, you know, are you experiencing the best possible life or your worst possible life? A more newer scale is the satisfaction with life scale that you see on the bottom left. This is developed in 1985, but it's one of those measures that's been used widely. It's been validated across different contexts, different cultures, and it's kind of again a simple, user-friendly type questionnaire that is 5 items to assess people's general sense of satisfaction with life. So you get a score across those items, and you can rate, you know, how satisfied you are with life. Another scale that does a similar thing is the objective happiness scale, right? It came out in the 1999, and it assesses your happiness using a couple of items and giving you an average score of how happy you are in your life. So these scales have been useful for understanding the of individuals' overall quality of life, and they've been useful in ways to increase people's general sense of well-being.
Hi, Saida. Can I interrupt for just a second and request, can you switch your microphone to your laptop microphone or a different one? It's just coming through a little bit fuzzy.
Oh, okay. I will do that.
No worries. Thank you.
Yeah. How does it sound like that?
I think we'll keep going forward and hopefully this will be good.
Okay, but did it change?
I can't tell quite yet. Sounds like there's still a little bit of fuzziness in there.
Okay, how about now?
Oh, that's good.
Better? Okay, okay.
Thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
No, thank you for letting me know. I didn't want it to be that way for the whole time.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so we were talking about these kind of more generally worded scales, and you know, it's being used widely. Even world leaders and governments also have shown interest in them. They're easy to do, administer, and they use it to assess their kind of citizens' quality of lives. But one limitation is that these types of measures require retrospection, and with self-reports in surveys, they rely on recall from people to kind of assess the generality of their lives to give us an impression of whether they are satisfied with their lives or not. The measures are kind of usually trait level measures, so they're not expected to change over time, and they summarize a person's well-being with just one score. However, as we all know, well-being in the real world is not as cleanly kind of put, right? It's not stable, it's not unidimensional, it's impacted by context, by time, and these factors are not taken into consideration the more global measures. The global measures are fine for the purposes that they were created, but we need to make sure that if our purpose is to get a glimpse of people's lives, those measures are not suitable, and we need to think about other ways of going about it. So basically, a more recent framework of well-being came out, and I'm saying recent, it was 2011 that it came out, which kind of introduced in the field that well-being is a multidimensional construct that it can be explained through various elements. So it's made up of various elements. This framework is called PERMA, the acronym for the 5 elements that were proposed to be part of this framework. P for positive emotions, so feeling joyful and contented. E for engagement, feeling a flow in your activities. R for social relationships and feeling connected and loved with others. M for meaning, having a sense of purpose and meaning in life, and A for accomplishment, feeling success in achieving your goals. In 2016, a measurement scale for assessing PERMA called the PERMA Profiler came out that captures the 5 PERMA elements as trait level factors. So, so there's a kind of it assesses these 5 elements in a global manner with 3 items per element. So if you can see, the items are worded in a general way. So let's say for the R element, the item that measures relationships is, in general, to what extent have you been feeling loved? And so again, there's kind of an emphasis on recall, and you as kind of the person trying to assess the overall experience of your life, and giving us an impression of how you feel about your relationships. So with this, we have the limitations of the recall bias. It prevents the examinations of people's kind of dynamical experiences of well-being moment to moment and day to day, and how it changes over time. And it also kind of
neglects the effect of context on our well-being. So what our research team did was attempted to adapt this global but multidimensional measure of well-being to a measure that is sensitive to change across time. So what we did was we created an adaptation of PERMA profiler called MPERMA, or momentary PERMA, and we tried to reword the items in a more momentary fashion. So if in PERMA we had an item that said, in general, how often do you feel joyful? We would change it into a statement that would say, I am feeling joyful right now, and people would rate that from not at all to extremely on a sliding scale. So we did this for all the items that corresponded to the measures of the PERMA elements. This type of measure is suitable for research designs that assess momentary experiences. One such design is ecological momentary assessment. It's a type of experience sampling method. So we use these, we use smartphones as well as health monitors to kind of examines people's in the moment experiences as they go about their daily lives in their natural environments. So in order to kind of test and validate our newly developed MPERMA measure, we conducted a 14-day EMA study. So what would happen in this study is that participants would receive 6 random prompts every day for 14 days. And these would come in again randomly to their smartphones so that they wouldn't predict the notification coming in and to prepare for it. So it was kind of, it would come as a surprise, and they were instructed to respond to them as they came in. So, you know, no preparation. In the moment when the notification came in, they would have to answer a couple of questions about their well-being, right? And so they there were items about all of the elements of PERMA. We also had an item that asked them, how relaxed do you feel right now? This was our attempt to measure stress, because when we piloted this, we got feedback from our participants that we hate answering a question that asks, are you stressed right now? Are you stressed right now? And so they did not like that at all. Hence the kind of the positive reframing of the item focusing on relaxed. So if they're not relaxed, it would imply that they are stressed. So there were kind of around 12 to 13 items. It would take them 1 to 2 minutes. They would complete it on their smartphones. They would go about their day to kind of capture their experience at that moment in their natural environments as they're going about their lives. We used network analysis to get a glimpse of the structure of the PERMA items, the MPERMA items, and to kind of see whether these elements as a whole came together as a network of well-being, while the 3 items that measured each of the elements were kind of intercorrelated and indicating that they were measuring that construct. And indeed, we were able to find that, as you can see in the network map that you're seeing here. Basically, every color represents a PERMA element, and the nodes, the circles, represent an item that was measuring the PERMA element. So you see that all the colors cluster together and they're highly correlated, which kind of proves the exclusivity of these items and elements. But at the same time, they also have ties with other elements, which, you know, they're weak, but that's great to see, because then that shows that they form a network of well-being as a whole. So now that kind of we made sure that our M-PERMA measure was intact, we did other validation tests as well, which, for the sake of time, I'm not going into right now. After that, we wanted to use that measure to kind of see whether there actually is daily variation in well-being, right? We assume that there is based on what we know so far, and just based on our human experiences, we have ups and downs in daily lives, right? So we wanted to see what data would show, and whether there was daily variation. So here you see a plot of one person's assessments of their positive emotions, their pleasantness across the duration of the study. And you see that there's a lot of ups and downs. There's a lot of fluctuations happening in this person's experience across time. We now go into looking at their levels of engagement. The same thing, you see a lot of fluctuations over time for this person. Their relationship, a little bit different trend, but there's a lot happening there that we wouldn't have known if we didn't use such a assessment tool to get at. You see meaning here and accomplishment. So these are all the PERMA elements put together on a plot over time for this one person. In this next plot, you see a second person's experiences over time with the same 5 PERMA elements. You can obviously right now see that people experience the well-being elements in different ways, and they show different within person trends, right? The patterns are different. The first person is completely experiencing this completely different to the second person, and we're basically kind of overlooking all of this information when we don't capture when we use those kind of global measurements, the one-time measurements. So our next kind of attempt was to, now that we know that there's a lot of variation both within person and across people, how can we really characterize and identify these different patterns so that we can use them to now predict those global states of well-being? So we needed to, come up with a score, a metric that would tell us, the difference between the characteristics of this person's experience to the next person's experience. One metric that we used was intra-individual mean, meaning that we kind of took the average of all of every person's experiences across time to get a sense of what their kind of mean level experience was. So we would call it baseline, or it's intra-individual means, so within person means. So this black line in these 2 plots indicate the mean of their experience across time. Each of these plots represent an example person's experience, and you can see that already, despite the fluctuations, their mean level experience is different from each other. So this metric will kind of give us information about that. The next metric that we used was intra-individual variability. So intra-individual variability gives us a value assigned to the amount of fluctuation that one has around their own mean. So if you look at person A and person B next to each other, their mean levels, the straight black line, is pretty much, similar to each other. However, their experiences are not the same because the person on the left, or person A, is showing a lot of fluctuation and ups and downs. Person on the right, person B, is very much stable in that regard. So this was intra-individual variability, or IIV, that we also quantify, that we use to quantify the patterns of experiences across time for people. So then what we wanted to do was to see whether these intra-individual characteristics were good predictors of people's overall general kind of global assessments of their well-being. Because basically we believe that it's you know, the moments basically build up to create that that global assessment that we come up with. So kind of understanding whether the characteristics of how we experience those moments, does that predict how we would do in generally in life. So we used a Bayesian linear regression kind of modeling approach, which really aims to determine the most optimal posterior distribution of model parameters. So the posterior distribution is really derived from the likelihood of the data that we have and the prior distribution that we might have and we might provide the model. The Bayesian approach was useful in our case because we wanted to explore the effects of several different predictors simultaneously. So what the Bayesian regression allows us to do is to compare the different regression models that correspond to the different combinations of predictors, and then evaluate the most kind of optimal combination in terms of predicting our outcome variable, which was kind of the general global assessments of well-being. So we kind of fed these predictors. It would test out all the different combinations of the predictors together, as you know, and then identify the most optimal one that was related to the global assessments of well-being. So we divided those global assessments of well-being into the two components that I kind of introduced to you at the beginning of the talk. We assessed these dynamic characteristics with regards to hedonic well-being or emotional well-being. And again, another time with regards to eudaimonic well-being and flourishing, as we would call it. So here we're looking at the eudaimonic well-being. So we wanted to see out of the 5 PERMA elements and across the different characteristics that we identified, which are the most predictive of people's eudaimonic levels of well-being. So those more long-lasting components of well-being, meaning, you know, that sense of striving for accomplishment that might not necessarily be pleasurable at the moment, but that, you know, but we pursue them for their own sake because they give us a sense of well-being beyond the momentary pleasures. So in this case, we found that, as we would expect, components in the PERMA framework, such as R, relationship, M, meaning, and A, accomplishment, which are the eudaimonic components of well-being, were the best predictors of the global assessments of well-being. But the interesting part was that only different aspects of their momentary kind of dynamics were predictive of those global assessments. So for relationships, it was kind of those baselines or mean levels of experience that came out as predictive of well-being. Meaning, also baseline levels were most important. So this means that if you're regardless of how much you fluctuate on a day-to-day basis, in terms of the amount of support you get from your surroundings, the amount of meaning and purpose that you experience, you might have moments that you don't feel you're striving for your purpose or you have purpose in your life. And then there are moments that you really feel like your life is meaningful. And so it doesn't matter how much fluctuation, it matters what the average level of your experiences are for your overall sense of eudaimonic well-being. However, for accomplishment, it's very interesting. We found that it's the fluctuations and not the average levels in accomplishment that matter, that predict your general sense of well-being. So in day-to-day life, and it was a negative relationship, which was very interesting. So in your day-to-day life, if you experience a lot of fluctuations in your sense of accomplishment, it's going to predict lower levels of eudaimonic well-being. But if you have a stable but higher averages in your not necessarily high, but stable experiences of accomplishment, of feeling, success, then that's better for your well-being. It predicts higher levels of well-being. So this was kind of an interesting twist that we kind of got out by just examining people's patterns of experiences in their day-to-day lives throughout these 5 different domains that make up well-being. When we looked at kind of predicting hedonic well-being, which is more the kind of the happiness, the joy, the momentary pleasures that are fleeting, but good to have also in your life. And as expected, we found that the best optimal fitting model was when positive emotions was the only predictor of the model, and positive emotions came out as kind of most predictive of hedonic well-being. And it was only the baseline levels of positive emotion. So again, it's not the fluctuations, it's the average levels that you experience. So it's okay if you have those low moments. It's really about kind of, balancing those low moments with the high moments to get a higher average of positive emotions towards your kind of general assessments of your well-being and emotional well-being in this case specifically. So now that we have this information, how can we use it to intervene in people's lives and really understand how our interventions impact people's experiences in the real world and in real time? Exciting stuff. So we attempted to do some ecological momentary interventions, looking at delivery of the interventions through the smartphones, while also assessing their well-being using the EMA design that I explained to you. This is kind of leading into these just-in-time interventions, which are the kind of the real-time interventions, so that when we get information from you as you're living your daily life, we can instantaneously identify what your needs are at that moment and provide you with the intervention needed. That's the end goal. We're not there yet, but this is kind of moving in that direction. So a classical intervention design is basically a pre-test intervention and then a post-test. And then the intervention, in our case, has a control group. We have an intervention group that receives positive practices like gratitude, your best possible self, writing assignments, all of that. And then there's a third group that has positive practices along with meditative practices. So the design for an ecological momentary intervention is not as simple as a pre-post design. So we had 56 days for the study that we designed, the 3 groups that I just mentioned. People would come in day 0 to do kind of a lab introductory session. They would complete some surveys there. They would then be hooked up for their phones and their kind of health monitors, their watches for our study, and they would go on for the next 14 days just getting the EMAs, just getting the assessments, right? So this is our pre-test. basically were trying to assess their momentary experiences, those patterns of their experiences in their lives, and seeing, how their lives look like before we even intervene. After that, they go on to a 15-day intervention period where, along with the 6 times per day assessments that they originally were getting, now there's an addition of interventions at the end of the day for them. So the control group would get a memory task on their phone that they would have to complete. The positive practices group would get positive practices, 1 each night to complete. And then the third group would get positive practices alongside some meditative practices that they would have to conduct. We then conducted a post session for 2 weeks, again, examining their well-being, moment to moment, 6 times a day for the 13 days in this case. They came into the lab. We kind of took them through another set of surveys in person, and then they started another 14 days post intervention so that we could kind of see the longer term effects. So here we're trying to examine the trajectories of change for these people as they went through this intervention design across the 3 groups. So what you see here is each plot is showing one of the groups, control, the positive practices and positive practices on meditative practices. This is an indication, this is kind of their reports of positive emotions. And when we do a growth curve modeling, which kind of gives us a smoothed out kind of a sense of whether the people's experiences changed from before the intervention, during the intervention, after the intervention, we see no differences. And that was kind of one of the things that shocked us. We put so much into this. There's no differences. There's no differences across groups. And there also doesn't seem to be any sort of growth happening. This was positive emotions, the same thing for engagement, same thing for relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. But then when we zoomed in, we realized that we're overlooking the nuances that make up those experiences that were in the previous analysis smoothed out, right? And so here you see an example of 3 people's data across the duration of the study. And you can see that people are not only showing within percent differences across the 5 elements, but also differences across people in how their patterns of momentary and experiences and dynamics are in their daily lives. There are differences in their baseline levels. There are differences in the amount of fluctuation and variability that they experience. There's also differences in their regulation levels. This is another metric that we used in this case to identify patterns of people's experiences in their kind of real world lives. What we mean by regulation levels is kind of the amount of time it takes for some person to come back to their baseline when they have been removed. So basically, when you deviate from your baseline, how long does it take you to come back to your baseline? And that's kind of a measure of inertia or a person's regulation levels. So with that observation, we thought that, you know what, it's not enough for us to assess interventions in this kind of pre-post general manner. And even when we're doing growth curve modeling, we're really missing out on those kind of faster time scale movements that are occurring in people's lives that might actually distinguish one person's experience to the next one where it was lumped up in other ways of looking at this. So the kind of process-oriented model that we proposed basically explained changes in interventions as a learning process. So what we expect to see is that when we consider evidence-based interventions that are with the aim of promoting positive health and well-being outcomes that I kind of mentioned before, we kind of see these interventions as inputs on the left side that capitalize a learning process, and if successful, then is expected to activate change mechanisms. For example, change mechanisms such as acting on the positive, increasing the positive, or increases of positive evaluations, positive cognitive evaluations, or increased present moment awareness. So that's kind of like the change mechanisms that we kind of expect to see. So these change mechanisms then are expected to yield quantifiable changes in psychological well-being in terms of the processes, the dynamic processes that I just talked about, the baselines, the intra-individual variations, the regulations, which are kind of linked to improved psychological well-being over time. So through this kind of framework or conceptual framework, we can also assess how moderating factors such as person's beginning levels of negative affect or their acceptability of the intervention influence whether or not a particular individual is likely to succeed in this particular program. So basically, the aim is that through this, we can explore how an intervention works and for whom it might be effective. And this kind of deep diving is needed for us to be able to sparse out those details that we usually miss in our intervention designs, especially now that we have all this technology and we can actually do it in the real world and in real time. We also came up with a analytical tool, a methodological approach called growth of hierarchical autoregression. It's basically the combination of autoregression models and growth models. So autoregressive modeling captures the fast time scales, right? The baseline levels, the regulation, the intra-individual variations that we identified, in the moment-to-moment experiences. And growth curve models captures the longer-term changes. And when we combine these two, then we can kind of get a sense of how these faster dynamics now change across these longer-term moments pre and post intervention. So we kind of really put a lens into what's happening and try to understand the picture through that lens. We also use these kind of moderators of heterogeneous processes, which kind of helps us identify for whom an intervention works and for whom it doesn't. All right, so what did we find when we applied this new conceptual framework and this new analytical tool onto the intervention study that we did? Originally, we did a growth curve modeling. We didn't see patterns, right? Now we wanted to kind of use this kind of more nuanced methodology to see if we find any differences across the groups, but across people as well. We tested changes in the 3 dynamic characteristics across time and across the 3 groups. Changes in the baseline, those averages, were greatest in the control group, interestingly, but and we also found out that the baseline dynamic was the most sensitive to group effects compared to intra-individual variability and inertia or regulation. We again didn't find any group effect. So well-being interventions were not effective in changing well-being dynamics compared to the control group. We can even say that our control group might have even done better, which was a surprise to us. There's a couple of reasons why this might be. Participants in the control group, they might have had the lowest starting level, which might have bumped them a little bit higher than the other ones. We didn't kind of control for that in this analysis. The digital monitoring alone was kind of more effective for well-being change than the actual interventions, which also is a possibility. And maybe the frequent interruptions that were included with the interventions might have kind of really biased these results. Further, what was interesting when we kind of again used the process-oriented perspective, we then wanted to kind of assess, could it be that some groups of people benefited from these interventions and some didn't, but because they were piled up in one group, we couldn't identify those differences. So basically we want to answer for whom do these well-being EMIs work. The results show that positive practices with brief meditation exercises, so the third group, might have been particularly unsuitable for individuals with high levels of negative affect. So what we did was that we used baseline levels of negative affect. So if people starting the program rated their negative affect and their positive affect in general, right? What is your kind of rating of your negative emotions and negative experiences and negative affect? We use that metric to use as a moderator to see whether if a person started with a lower level of negative affect or a higher level of negative affect, would they be benefiting from this intervention, or would they be at a disadvantage? And we actually found that people who started with lower levels of negative affect were at a disadvantage with the meditation addition. So with the PPI, the positive practices, it was most beneficial for people with lower levels of negative affect, and then people who were experiencing higher levels of negative affect, kind of borderline depressed, weren't really benefiting from the meditations. Interestingly, people with lower negative affect really improved across both interventions. So there was a difference in where you started and how you would be impacted by the interventions that we didn't, consider when we weren't really kind of taking the process-oriented perspective. All right, I know that I really ran long on this talk, but I'm going to conclude now with some remarks about the possibilities and challenges with this type of approach, really understanding well-being as a multifaceted construct in a real-world kind of context with these kind of ecologically sensitive monitors and interventions. So there are a lot of possibilities out there. There's so much that we can do with this. Firstly, we can kind of use these approaches to get at a highly tailored, person-specific, in-depth understanding of change in people. Right now, the field is going towards idiographic kind of perspectives, really understanding person by person and each person's experiences in their own context in relation to how they're doing and how we can help them. So we need to go kind of in that direction, and these methodology, which are giving us a better glimpse of each person's experiences across time in their natural environments, are going to help us towards that. we definitely do need to move towards time-sensitive quantitative modeling. So we need to use more dynamical modeling and Bayesian techniques that promote those real-time interaction and model updating. We also need to be thinking about maturing interventions. People are not going to be in the same state over time. So after a while, an intervention is going to become useless because they're saturated in it. They've had enough of that aspect. They need a change, right? So we need to be thinking about maturing interventions that can be updated based on a person's state over time. Of course, there are challenges to it. These are time-intensive designs, and they are burdensome and time-consuming to both the researchers as well as the participants. It took us 3 years to get to what I was able to present to you right now and collect that data. So it's a lot of kind of time and energy that goes into these things to be able to get a better understanding of how to approach real world experiences. EMA reactivity is a challenge, which is something I think we also saw in our study. By EMA reactivity, what I mean is that the assessment itself sometimes gets in the way and becomes an intervention. And it impacts people's experiences while we're not trying to really intervene, we're only assessing, right? But sometimes the EMA reactivity happens and we need to take that into consideration. Another aspect of these designs, which kind of bring about the challenges, is that we need to include multiple timescales, meaning that we not only need to understand kind of the shorter timescales, the micro timescales, the moments, hours, days, weeks. We also need to consider the longer timescales. So that kind of requires an intensive study design, and again, a lot of kind of burden, time consuming, and complications with methodology as well. But overall, I think we're kind of in a good stage where we're trying to challenge ourselves to reach those kind of the possibilities that are out there, and to venture and to make sure that we move these kind of understandings of psychological constructs, especially well-being, from the lab to the real world and understand them in real time. Last but not least, I wanted to thank my research team, my beautiful lab, my lab manager, James Rumbawa, which helped produce those cool science maps that I showed you at the beginning, the bibliometric methods, and my mentors and my colleagues who have been with me the whole time, and the John Templeton Foundation, which funded a part of what I presented to you today during our research projects. Thank you so much for listening. Here is my email, and I'm ready for any questions you might have.
Thank you so much. I think I'll let you moderate here. So I'll open up the floor. Go right ahead.
Do we have any questions?
I certainly have one.
I know I ran long, so I think it might take people a little moment, like, to just kind of digest everything.
Can I ask you, maybe this is probably a naive question. How do you gauge the fact that one person's understanding of, say, contentment or happiness is not somebody else's? I mean, this is like a running joke with like my wife and me. It's like, she can tell when I'm getting sick, and I'm like, I'm okay. But my version of okay is not her version of okay. I mean, yeah. How do you deal with kind of like relativity in self-assessment of contentment, happiness, well-being, pick your term in there? Mm-hmm. You're trying to establish what are actually, as you show, some pretty empirically demonstrable baselines for how we do quantitatively assess well-being?
I love that question. That's kind of like the question that comes up in psychological research, really, because these are kind of very subjective constructs. We do experience them differently, but I think the approach that we're taking nowadays has improved on kind of the limitations that, again, previous approaches have had, where we're pairing subjective reports with objective measurements, like the health monitors. So basically trying to really understand the two in tandem to get a good glimpse of a person's experience, and especially now that we can go out of the lab and still have those data from people. And then also at the same time, which is why we kind of need more idiographic perspectives, because it's comparing one person to themselves, right? Whatever your baseline is, we're going to be comparing you to your baseline and not the next person's baseline. So whatever your understanding of well-being is and whatever your satisfaction with life is, we'll compare you today with you tomorrow and you the next day. So hopefully those will kind of transcend the challenges of the subjectivity of the matter, and that's a known thing among everyone, that psychology is really not tangible, so we have to just do the best that we can do to get a tangible understanding of what's happening. Did anyone access the QR code to play around with the science map? Those are really fun.
I had another one too that kind of was part of the same thing. Have you do you ever track like vital signs that go along with this? I mean, I would be curious if I wouldn't even know if this matters at all, but I don't know, blood pressure or pulse and heart rate. I mean, I think about the way that like the new Apple Watches and whatever are tracking every last thing in people's bodies as ways of trying to get these holistic pictures of well-being.
Yeah,
that would be like, for lack of a better term. And I'm wondering if that at all syncs up with what you're doing. When you speak about like the impossibility of getting to the inside states, but I'm curious if you ever found anything like actually all the people who were trending in this direction, whatever, they had drops in blood pressure or.
No, I mean, that's actually a line of my work that was kind of a little bit deviated from what I was saying, but the whole study that I showed you actually was paired up with a health monitor. So we had measurements of not blood pressure, but heart rate and electrodermal activity and metrics such as that. And so interestingly, we were actually piloting this because we kind of used that data for the just in time, the maturing interventions that I was kind of hinting on a little bit on. Our Penn State group is using that data to see whether there are kind of physiological indicators that precede our psychological state assessments that can help us prevent maybe some, stressful state that we might be experiencing, so that we can kind of help people before they even get there, right? Like maybe your heart rate is starting to build up before you actually get to the point where you're furious, angry, or like or stressed or anxious, or trying to blow up, or something dangerous. So we monitored those together, and we actually were able to find activities in the kind of skin monitors, their electrodermal activities that kind of preceded people's stress and anxiety when they were able to subjectively report. We had a participant who was going into a big event that was crowded and piled up, and they were getting a sort of like a panic attack because of the social anxiety that was happening. And interestingly, they at a point they realized that they were having a panic attack, and they kind of came out of the context, and they had to like take a moment to get better. But when we looked at their physiological data, which kind of was before they realized that they were having a panic attack, we saw that the electrodermal activity was already on the rise and was abnormal before they even were aware of it. So there's definitely physiological kind of connections between our psychological states. We don't have a specific physiological kind of indicator that can kind of tell us, your level of well-being. But when it gets to those kind of more extreme experiences, the physiological monitors definitely help in objectifying some of these measures.
Really interesting. Thank you.
Of course.
I want to offer to anyone, if you'd like to drop questions into the chat, I would be happy to moderate them for you. So please do feel free to use the chat if you don't want to come onto camera. You're welcome to use your camera as well, or raise your hand.
I think my talk was so clear. No one had questions.
If anybody's thinking of any last questions, I do want to take a moment to just thank you on behalf of the Center for Governance and Markets for sharing this time with us in your presentation and for joining us this afternoon.
Of course, it was a pleasure.
From your campus living room office, as we heard.
Exactly, from my second home.
There's a question in the chat from my colleague Ryan McDermott. Do you have some more English professors among you? How can college students?
Yay, I love English professors. I mean, did you tell them that I got my bachelor's in English?
English major, can you believe this? This is an English major who can work with Bayes and with statistics. How about that? and is a psych professor now. That is.
Look at that.
Multifaceted.
Yeah, we need to look into my life to see what predicted all of this.
That one, I'm not sure was not sure that was forecast. So he asked, how can college students adapt what you've learned for their own practices? Good question. Very appropriate.
Yeah. Very good question. So interestingly, my developmental lens actually takes into consideration emerging adults. So basically college students who have just come into, the adulthood phase, and they're trying to figure out their context and their lives. And we examined these PERMA elements, the well-being elements, the 5 elements within college students, trying to see whether kind of their experience also reflected the general kind of impression that we have about well-being. Yes, they showed that the elements really work together in the same way that it would for anyone else. But when we looked at the centrality of which element was more important to college students for their well-being in that network of well-being that we kind of displayed, we found that out of the 5 elements, positive emotions and positive relationships, so feeling loved and supported and experiencing joy and contentment, were kind of the 2 elements that were central, meaning that they were interconnected widely to all the other elements. So if these 2 increased, all the other elements would increase. If these 2 decreased, all the other elements would decrease. And so these 2 elements for this age group and this in the context that they're in is very central to their well-being. Which kind of, again, gets at the point where, and developmentally, it makes sense. So developmentally, we know that college students really come to connect, come to, they're trying to explore new relationships. They're in that phase of creating intimacy developmentally. And then also, the parties, the fun, all the joy that comes with coming together with all of their, peers is also kind of, again, very, very important in that phase of life, at least to their well-being. So one, I think, takeaway from all of that is that if we were to intervene, or if college students were to improve their well-being, starting with these 2 elements would help them in all of the other elements of their well-being and generally in their kind of satisfaction with life. So kind of intervening in, their sense of kind of pleasurable moments, their joyful moments in life, and also increasing their social positive relationships and feeling supported, feeling connected to others. Those 2 are important. And once those 2 kind of are increased, then at least our data shows that hopefully their meaning in life will increase, their kind of sense of, going for their goals and success, will be increased, and their engagement in the day-to-day activities and in their lives would be increased.
Good answer.
I hope that answers it.
Last call on questions.
I thought you were going to call on people in class. No one's going to ask a question. I'm going to call on you.
That's right. That's right. Well, thank you again for this. This has been really, really fantastic. I learned so much today. Thanks for joining us. And
thank you for inviting me, for having me here. This was very fun, kind of just talking to a new audience, and I hope that it was, at least the content was appropriate enough for the focus of the talk series and also the community that I was talking to.
Definitely so, definitely. So Brian can let us know when the recording is posted, and we'll do a little round of publicity for that. And otherwise, enjoy some weather that is surely better than the snow and slush here. And
I'm sorry, it's really sunny here. I feel sorry for you.
You did your time in Pennsylvania, though, so you.
I did, definitely did.
Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a great rest of your days.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.